Tonight, we dive into 3 disturbing Appalachian Mountains horror stories unearthed from the blood-soaked soil of Alabama. Like the shattered, tortured soul eternally bound to a graveyard in Lynette, and a terrifying spectral soldier stalking the ruins of a Civil War hospital in Talladega County. But first, we venture into the dead children's playground to witness the unspeakable shadows that have been lurking since the 1918 plague. I'm the Shadow Teller. Let the nightmare begin. Have you ever been so completely exhausted from work that all you wanted was just 5 uninterrupted minutes of peace and quiet? You know the feeling. You take your kids to a local playground, sit down on a bench, and let out a huge sigh of relief, thinking you finally have a moment to just breathe. But what if that brief moment of total relaxation was actually the setup for the most terrifying morning of your entire life? Meet Sandra, a deeply stressed-out, sleep-deprived secretary who was just sitting at the park trying to relax, but ended up regretting that decision more than anything else in the world. It was 8 a.m. in 1986. Commuter exhaust fumes hung thick in the crisp morning air as Sandra parked near the edge of Maple Hill Cemetery in Huntsville, Alabama. Sandra was a deeply stressed-out secretary, and her only goal this morning was to just sit down, relax, and unwind for a few minutes away from the crushing pressure of her office. She had her 2 young girls with her, 7-year-old Catherine, who always liked to be in charge, and 6-year-old Daniela, who had wild, unstoppable energy. They were heading into a hidden, rocky limestone alcove right next to the graveyard, a place locals called the Dead Children's Playground. Sandra's anemia made the damp morning chill slice right through her jacket, and every step over the crunchy, frozen frost heaves shot a sharp ache up through her joints. Looking at the damp playground equipment bleeding streaks of red rust water, her stomach turned. She called out to the girls, warning them strictly not to touch their faces after putting their hands all over this dirty park. Satisfied they heard her, Sandra sat down on a cold stone bench, opened her book, and exhaled. But before she could read a single word, a high-pitched giggle bounced off the heavy limestone wall directly behind her, and she knew instantly that laugh did not belong to either of her daughters. Sandra's head snapped up. She checked the empty swings to her left, then looked over at the rusting slide to her right. The playground appeared completely deserted, but as she squinted through the thick morning mist, a shape slowly materialized in the distance, all the way across the cracked asphalt. It was another mom, wrapped in a long trench coat, standing silently as she watched her young son play in the dirt. A heavy wave of relief washed over Sandra. She wasn't alone. You see, lately, Sandra's job as a secretary had been absolutely running her into the ground. She was completely sleep-deprived and constantly fighting off these brutal, nagging headaches. But this morning, she was absolutely determined to push through it, unwind, and just have a good day. From over on the swing set, Daniela called out, aggressively demanding her mom watch how high she could go. Just as Sandra looked over, the blinding morning sun bounced off the nearby granite tombstones and hit her right in the face. A sharp, familiar throb spiked behind her eyes. She winced, vigorously rubbing her temples with one hand while digging blindly into her heavy purse with the other. Sandra forced a bright smile, shot her daughter a thumbs up, and called out a quick, "Great job!" Her fingers finally found a small travel bottle in her bag. She popped 2 chalky aspirins into her mouth and washed them down with a quick swig of water. The sharp pressure in her head finally began to fade. Sandra shifted her weight on the cold stone bench, crossing her legs and settling her back against the hard rock. She took a deep, long breath, telling herself she deserved this quick break. She smoothed out the pages of her book, finally letting her guard down completely. But just as her eyes focused on the very first line, an icy puff of air hit her neck, and a child's voice whispered directly into her left ear. Sandra froze, the icy breath still lingering on her neck. But before her brain could even process what she had just experienced, a terrified shriek ripped through the damp morning air. It was Daniela. She had slipped on the slick metal of the rusting slide and scraped her knee. Sandra's mom instincts instantly overrode her panic. She dropped her book, ripped a bandage out of her heavy purse, and sprinted across the frosty asphalt. She scooped Daniela into a tight hug and pressed the bandage over the bleeding scrape. Now, as Sandra was kneeling there in the dirt, she glanced across the park. The other mom was already packing up her son's toys. They made brief eye contact, and the woman just gave Sandra a polite, sympathetic mom nod before taking her little boy's hand and walking off toward the parking lot. It was just a totally normal family calling it a day. Sandra slowly stood up and dusted off her jeans. As the sound of the other woman's car engine faded away down the street, the heavy, suffocating silence of the cemetery dropped right back over the playground. The park was completely empty. They were totally alone. Sandra reached out to grab Daniela's hand so they could head back to the bench. But right as her fingers brushed her daughter's sleeve, the unmistakable sound of a little boy's laugh echoed out from deep inside the dark, enclosed plastic tubes of the jungle gym. Sandra scooped Daniela up onto her hip and practically sprinted around the rusted metal structure to the back of the jungle gym. This was the playground's one major blind spot. She fully expected to find some random kid who had wandered off from their parents and gotten stuck in the tubes. But when she rounded the corner, she only found Catherine sitting cross-legged in the dirt all by herself. Sandra let out a massive, shaky breath and set Daniela down. "Catherine, who were you just laughing with?" Catherine didn't even look up from the dirt. She just casually muttered that she was playing with a little boy and his toy. Sandra's heart immediately started hammering against her ribs. She knew for a fact the other mom and her son had already driven away. The surrounding cemetery was dead silent. There was absolutely no boy here. Panic tightening her chest, Sandra demanded to know exactly where this kid went. Catherine finally stopped playing, lifted her small hand, and silently pointed a single finger directly into the thick, dark tree line bordering the graveyard. Sandra tightened her grip on Daniela and grabbed Catherine's free hand. Her maternal instincts were completely hijacked. If there was a little boy wandering around these woods all by himself, he was in serious danger. Where were his parents? She frantically scanned the empty asphalt, the cracked sidewalks, and the rows of granite tombstones. There wasn't a single adult anywhere. Determined to help, Sandra marched her girls straight past the thick, spiderweb-covered tree line and deep into the woods. Instantly, the heavy, metallic smell of damp, overturned earth filled her lungs. She stopped. The shadows stretched endlessly through the thickets of oak and pine. 1 minute passed, then 2. The woods were dead silent. Sandra's mind started to spiral into the absolute worst-case scenarios. What if he fell? What if he was taken? Panic clawed at her throat as the horrifying reality of a missing child set in. She was just about to shout for help when Catherine gave her hand a hard tug. "Right there, Mommy," Catherine whispered. "It's right there." Sandra's eyes darted to the ground. Instantly, a freezing, paralyzing wave of pure terror hit her like a freight train. All the blood drained from her face, and her stomach dropped straight into her shoes. She was absolutely terrified. She instinctively slapped her free hand over her mouth to stop herself from screaming out loud. Because sticking out of the loose, damp dirt, just inches from her boots, was something half buried. You see, to fully understand the sheer paralyzing panic gripping Sandra right now, you have to know the dark history of exactly where she was standing. Back in September of 1918, Huntsville was ground zero for Alabama's very first cases of the Spanish flu. By October, a brutal medical crisis swept through the town, taking the lives of countless children who were all buried right there in Maple Hill Cemetery. Locals openly warned people to stay away, reporting that empty swings would move violently on their own with zero wind. Even worse, there were deeply unsettling, unconfirmed legends that the bodies of children abducted back in the 1960s were eventually found hidden deep in these exact woods. Sandra stared down at the dirt. Half buried in the damp earth was a cracked, sun-bleached 1960s action figure, the exact toy Catherine had just casually described. And sitting perfectly placed right next to it were two tiny, muddy, child-sized shoes. They were completely empty. Sandra didn't hesitate. She grabbed both girls by the arms, dragged them out of the trees, and sprinted across the frosty asphalt. She threw them into the back seat of her station wagon, slammed the doors, and drove straight to the local police station. She practically kicked the doors down, demanding that officers go search that exact spot in the woods. Because of her sheer panic, they listened. Later that day, investigators dug up the dark soil right where Sandra and her girls had been standing. Buried just below the surface, they found the skeletal remains of a young boy who had gone missing decades ago. Have you ever walked past an old abandoned building and you just couldn't shake that heavy, terrifying feeling that someone inside was staring right at you? Most of us would just turn around and walk away. But what if running away was physically impossible? Meet James, a 26-year-old telegraph lineman working a miserable 12-hour shift deep in the Alabama Appalachian Mountains back in 1910. All he wanted to do was get his job done, tie off a single copper wire in the pouring rain, and earn the exact hazard pay he desperately needed to buy his late mother a proper marble headstone. But the rotting, abandoned hospital standing just 4 feet away from his pine pole wasn't nearly as empty as it looked, and his boring Monday was about to become an absolute nightmare. Copper pays the debts. Copper buys the marble. That phrase repeated on a loop in James's mind on a perfectly boring Monday afternoon in 1910. James worked as a telegraph lineman, and on this overcast day, he hung 30 feet in the air, strapped firmly to a raw, creosote-soaked pine pole on Cemetery Mountain in Talladega County. His cheap, undersized boots pinched his toes raw. He had to finish this line. The hazard pay for this remote mountain job was exactly enough to buy his late mother a proper marble headstone. Leaning his full body weight against his thick leather safety belt, James dug into his tin lunch pail. He chewed a dried peach, trying to settle his asthmatic lungs. To give you a clear picture of the layout, this pole stood just 4 feet away from the rotting exterior of an abandoned antebellum hospital. Distant lightning violently cracked across the valley. The isolated air grew incredibly heavy and thick with the incoming storm. James pulled his heavy 8-inch steel pliers from his belt to tie the copper. He kicked his iron climbing gaffs deeper into the mud-slicked bark, locking himself in place, but right as he squeezed the handles, a loud, sharp scrape of wood echoed from the hospital right next to him, and the wavy cylinder glass window, a window James had explicitly noted was sealed tight during his climb, now gaped halfway open. Now at first, James just shrugged it off. He blamed the weird movement on the incoming storm, gripped his steel pliers, and got right back to tying the copper line. But exactly 1 hour later, the weather took a massive turn. Even though it was still mid-afternoon, the storm clouds completely swallowed the sun. It grew incredibly dark. Between the pitch-black sky and the thick, driving rain, visibility dropped to almost zero. James could barely see past his own mud-slicked boots. Then, that exact same sharp scrape of wood ground over the howling wind. James stopped dead in his tracks, dropping his hands from the wire. Just 4 feet away from his face, that heavy oak window frame ground completely upward, locking open to expose the pitch-black hospital room. James froze in his harness, his mind racing to figure out what the heck was going on. Cemetery Mountain sat miles from civilization, and this old antebellum hospital was completely abandoned. And think about it. No natural wind lifts a solid oak window straight up vertically. His detail-oriented brain demanded an answer. He aggressively chewed his dried peach, forcing his sweaty, calloused palms to grip the wet pine pole. He leaned forward against his thick leather safety strap, stretching his neck across that tiny 4-foot gap toward the dark square. He drew a deep breath, preparing to yell into the void to check for squatters. He opened his mouth to shout over the thunder rumbles, but a violent flash of strobe lightning ripped the sky, and the heavy window violently slammed shut, shaking the rotting walls. Numbing cold punched James right in the chest. He completely abandoned his slow, methodical routine. He needed to secure this line and get back to the ground before a lightning strike hit the copper. It was only 4 p.m., but pitch blackness totally swallowed the mountain. Swaying pines aggressively scraped against the hospital roof, and the copper wire next to his ear hummed with a high-pitched scream. He frantically crimped the connectors, dropping a small copper sleeve from his clumsy, freezing fingers into the dark below. The whistling wind tore through old 1865 bullet holes in the rotting house. Even as he worked, he couldn't stop staring at that sealed cylinder glass. His mind kept racing. How did that heavy window move on its own? The sharp prickle of static electricity began to crawl right up his spine. He grabbed his heavy buffalo grips to lock the tension in the wire, but right as he did, a massive flash of lightning lit up that window like it was broad daylight, and what James saw standing just inches on the other side of that glass sent such a violent shock of terror through his system that his lungs locked up and his heart just stopped dead in his chest. Right then, the storm went full throttle. Thick pea soup fog swallowed the base of the pine pole, totally hiding the ground 30 feet below. The sharp pop of static electricity cracked across the porcelain insulators. James completely abandoned the unfinished copper line. His heart hammered so violently against his ribs, it felt like the bone might actually splinter. He was so deeply terrified by what was in that room, he didn't even weigh the massive risk of dying, snapping a leg, or getting severely hurt. He just needed to get to the ground immediately. To do a fast descent, he had to pull his chest flush against the creosote-treated pine to release his safety strap. But doing that forced his face just inches from that open hospital window. The heavy stench of wet, rotting wood and ozone poured over him. Wrapping his left arm tightly around the pole, his sweaty right hand fumbled blindly in the pitch blackness for the heavy iron snap hooks on his belt. He violently depressed the spring-loaded latch. The thick leather strap fell away, and he kicked his heels outward to rip his iron spikes from the bark. Gravity took over instantly. He slid down the pole, the rough wood tearing through his soggy wool shirt and creating massive burning heat against his skin. But right as he picked up speed, his wet iron climbing spike caught a hard knot 15 feet above the ground, violently flipping him backward through the empty air to snap his wrist and slam his skull against the hard, iron-red clay. Blinding agony ripped straight up James's arm. He gasped in the thick mud, violently spitting out rainwater and blood. The howling wind suddenly died, and the eerie, suffocating stillness of the storm's eye pressed heavily down on the mountain. Right next to his ear, dead leaves crunched hard under the weight of a heavy boot. James screamed, desperately clutching his shattered wrist against his chest. Above him, a massive flash of strobe lightning detonated in the sky. The sudden blast of white light tore through the darkness, and what stood revealed in that split second stole the scream right out of James's throat. Looming directly over his broken body was a Confederate soldier. Tattered butternut gray wool hung loosely off rotting bones. A rusted triangular bayonet attached to an old Enfield rifle pointed directly at his neck. Time completely slowed to a crawl. James couldn't drag a single breath into his burning lungs. His entire body violently shook against the freezing mud. His logical, detail-oriented brain just totally short-circuited. How was this even possible? The Civil War ended almost 50 years ago. This hospital was nothing but a rotting shell. Yet the heavy, suffocating stench of ancient blood and stale gunpowder hung right over his face in the dead air. Rainwater steadily dripped off that rusted bayonet blade, hovering less than an inch from his Adam's apple. He desperately commanded his legs to kick backward and escape, but his terrified muscles completely refused to fire. Those hollow eye sockets stared blindly down into his face, and the sheer, impossible terror of the moment completely overloaded his system. James's vision violently spiraled into pure blackness. He woke up completely alone in the mud at 6 p.m. The storm raged all around him again. His work truck sat parked just 50 yards down the trail, but his mind was so heavily shattered by the trauma that his body just went into absolute autopilot. He didn't even think to grab the keys. Instead of driving, his legs just decided to walk. Dragging his broken frame upright, he limped on foot for miles down into the Valley Telegraph office, completely soaked in freezing rain and blood. He slammed his good hand on the counter, begging his supervisor for an immediate reassignment. The boss just slowly nodded. He raised a finger, pointing to a perfectly dry wrapped oilcloth photograph and a pair of familiar steel pliers sitting right there on the desk. Your replacement found these tucked safely inside your closed tin lunch pail at the exact top of that pole, James. So who climbed up and packed your bags while you were unconscious? James stared at the dry photograph, his shattered wrist pulsing with fresh agony. But the terrifying truth of Cemetery Mountain defied all technical logic. Let's step back from the terror for a second and just look at the hard facts. Cemetery Mountain in Munford, Alabama, was genuinely the site of one of the final skirmishes of the Civil War in 1865. That rotting house was factually used as a Confederate hospital, and the Window Soldier is a widely documented local legend for that exact area. Now, a completely rational person would point right at James's physical reality in 1910. He was an asthmatic, exhausted guy working a 12-hour shift, breathing in toxic creosote fumes all day. A severe thunderstorm creates massive drops in barometric pressure, which severely messes with oxygen levels in the human brain. So, logic says the shape behind the glass was just strobe lightning aggressively reflecting off 1860s wavy cylinder glass. And that terrifying Confederate soldier standing directly over him in the mud, just a severe hallucination brought on by a traumatic 15-foot fall directly onto his bare skull. But there is one massive, undeniable piece of physical evidence that completely destroys that rational theory. James fell. He shattered his wrist and lay completely unconscious in the mud for 2 hours. The storm dumped freezing rain the entire time. Yet, when his replacement climbed that pole, he found James's heavy steel pliers and that fragile paper photograph of his late mother perfectly packed safely inside his closed tin lunch pail. That pail was sitting at the exact top of that 30-foot drop, and his mother's photograph inside was completely bone dry. A hallucination caused by a head injury cannot physically climb 30 feet of mud-slicked pine in a raging thunderstorm to neatly pack up a dying man's tools. Something physical, with real hands, was up on that pole while James bled out in the mud. Science tries to explain the glass. Gravity brutally explains the fall. Copper pays the debts, copper buys the marble, but copper doesn't buy back your mind. Imagine working a freezing midnight security shift in a pitch-black cemetery and finding a massive, life-sized brick dollhouse sitting right on top of a grave. But then, as you turn to walk away, an invisible little girl whispers, "Me want it now," directly into your ear. Meet Marley, a 53-year-old watchman who took this lonely job to survive the Great Depression, only to quickly wish he had never set foot inside those iron gates. It was a freezing cold Wednesday evening in December of 1935. A bitter winter storm had completely isolated the Appalachian border town of Lanett, Alabama. 53-year-old Marley stood inside the cramped Oakwood Cemetery office. He desperately needed this night watchman job to survive the Great Depression, so he wasn't about to complain about the weather. His heavy wool overcoat smelled faintly of cherry pipe tobacco as he stood dripping wet, waiting for his pass down from the site supervisor. The boss handed over the jangler, a massive ring of heavy iron keys. He didn't look Marley in the eye. Instead, he stared down at the floorboards and gave one highly specific, cryptic order: keep an extra eye on the brick dollhouse. Marley asked why in the world he needed to watch a child's grave so closely. The supervisor just shook his head, his jaw tight. "Just keep an extra eye on it," he muttered, quickly turning away and leaving the office. Needing the paycheck too badly to push the issue, Marley stepped out into the freezing rain and locked the main iron gates to start his shift, his stomach already tying itself into a tight knot. Just as the heavy iron gate clicked shut, a localized freezing wind whipped past his face. It carried a distinct, sickly sweet scent. Not the smell of wet earth or winter pine, but the unmistakable sterile stench of a 1930s hospital ward. Marley gripped his wooden nightstick, his knuckles turning white against the wood. Why would a pitch-black graveyard in the middle of the woods suddenly smell like medicine? Marley's shift was 8 long hours. If he kept a steady pace in the freezing rain, he could get about 6 or 7 full laps around the property. Black ice coated the granite headstones, turning the graveyard into a massive, slippery maze. With every step, his old patrol knee clicked loudly, echoing against the crunch of his iron-shod boots on the frozen dirt. About halfway through his first round, the yellow beam of his kerosene lantern hit the center plot, and Marley stopped dead in his tracks. His mouth hung wide open, and his eyes grew huge in absolute amazement. Sitting right there in the freezing mud wasn't a standard headstone. It was a massive, perfectly built brick dollhouse. Marley slowly walked up to it, completely stunned by the craftsmanship. He pulled off his wet glove and ran his thick, calloused fingers over the rough, perfectly laid red bricks. Real, functioning glass windows caught the reflection of his lantern. Tiny canvas awnings hung over the porch. A little metal mailbox sat out front. And inside, wooden shelves were packed tight with actual children's toys. He spent several minutes just walking around the perimeter, shaking his head in total disbelief that someone would build a literal house over a grave. Finally, Marley took one last step back, admiring the incredible detail one more time. He lowered his lantern and turned to begin his patrol route again. He took a single step forward, but right before his boot hit the ice, a young girl's voice whispered distinctly through the freezing wind. "Me want it now." Marley's heart hammered a frantic, heavy rhythm against his ribs. A cold sweat broke out under his thick wool coat, instantly chilling his skin. He swung his heavy lantern into the freezing rain, the yellow beam slicing through the darkness, but the red clay path was completely empty. The wind howled through the bare oak branches. That had to be it. The bitter draft was just whistling through the tiny metal mailbox on the Dollhouse porch, twisting the sound into something human. Marley swallowed hard, gripped his wooden nightstick, and forced himself to push forward to finish his rounds. An hour later, the icy route looped him right back to the center plot. The brick structure sat silently in the freezing mud. Marley stepped up to the tiny porch and shined his light through the glass windows. The wooden shelves, the little canvas awnings, the toys. Everything sat exactly where he had left it. The knot in his stomach finally loosened. He let out a long, foggy breath and lowered his lantern, satisfied the area was totally secure. He pivoted his heavy boot to step off the tiny porch. Before his foot even hit the ground, the exact same whisper echoed right below his shoulder. "Me want it now." Marley was genuinely spooked now. He whipped his kerosene lantern in every direction, the yellow beam slashing through the freezing rain, but the dark trees were completely empty. Relying on his old prison guard instincts, he squared his shoulders and did a classic call-out into the pitch-black woods. "Security! Come on out, you're going to get in trouble." Not a single branch snapped. The freezing wind just kept howling through the bare oaks. Marley started muttering into his thick cloth mask, cursing whatever possessed him to take this job. He was totally rattled. He dragged his clicking knee down the icy path to continue his patrol, constantly whipping his light back over his shoulder. The terrifying thought that a little girl was actually out here in the freezing dead of night gnawed at his brain. He forced his eyes forward, counting the snow-capped headstones one by one just to stay grounded in reality. A sharp pain hit his chest as his acid reflux flared up violently, burning his throat. The deeper he marched into the dark cemetery, the heavier the thick, wet scent of damp brick became. Then, the crunch of his iron-shod boots on the black ice stopped matching his stride. Crunch, crunch, crunch. A second set of tiny footsteps echoed right behind him. When those tiny footsteps echoed right behind him, Marley immediately told himself, "Nope, not having it." He refused to look back. He just lowered his head, tightened his grip on his wooden nightstick, and walked as fast as his bad knee would allow. He powered through the freezing rain, determined to just keep his head down, ignore the sounds, and survive the route. An hour later, the icy path looped him right back toward the center plot. Marley shook his head, muttering into his thick cloth mask. "I don't want to do this," he whispered, his stomach tying itself into a tight knot. He dragged his aching knee toward the spot, dreading what might be waiting for him. He swung his lantern forward. What Marley found, or rather, didn't find, could not have been possible. The massive, life-sized brick dollhouse was completely gone. Marley hurried forward, his iron-shod boots sliding wildly over the black ice. He stopped right at the edge of the grave. He whipped his lantern left, nothing but frozen grass. He whipped it right, just empty headstones. He stood staring at a bare patch of freezing mud where a literal brick building had stood just an hour ago. A hot, terrified sweat broke out across his forehead, instantly turning to ice in the bitter wind. His breathing grew jagged. He stepped up to where the tiny porch should have been and slowly reached his bare, trembling hand straight out into the dark. His fingers grabbed nothing but freezing rain. The air was totally empty. Before his brain could even process how an entire building could just vanish, A sharp, violent tug ripped at the heavy wool of his overcoat, right near his waistline. He spun around. Standing right there in the freezing rain was a pale, 4-year-old girl. She stared up at him. "Me want it now." Marley totally lost it. He scrambled backward in a pure panic, his heavy boots slipping wildly on the ice. He braced to hit the mud, but his spine slammed violently against solid, freezing brick. The dollhouse had instantly reappeared directly behind his back. The little girl didn't flinch. She just stared through the freezing rain. "Me want it now." Marley scrambled to his feet and sprinted blindly into the dark woods. A full minute later, his lungs burning, he collapsed behind a massive oak tree. His heart hammered against his ribs in absolute terror. But his stubborn, rule-following guard instincts locked his boots to the dirt. He sat frozen behind that tree in the pitch-black cold for the rest of the night, absolutely refusing to abandon his shift. So what actually happened to Marley out there in the freezing rain? To figure that out, we have to look at the factual history the graveyard supervisor absolutely refused to share. Nadine Earles was a real 4-year-old girl who contracted diphtheria back in 1933. Because the illness was so brutal and contagious, her parents had to turn her bedroom into a makeshift quarantine ward. The room constantly reeked of sterile alcohol and sickly sweet medicine. The exact same heavy scent that washed over Marley when he locked the cemetery gates. As she lay in that room, her father desperately tried to build her a playhouse out in the yard. The loud hammering hurt her ears. But right before she died, she made one final demand for her house. She told her parents, "Me want it now." To honor her dying wish, her family built that massive, life-sized brick dollhouse directly over her grave. Now, there are plenty of logical folks who will easily write off Marley's terrifying night. They claim the "me want it now" whisper is just a natural wind tunnel effect, the winter draft whistling through that tiny metal mailbox on the porch. They also point out that Marley was an exhausted 53-year-old man working an 8-hour shift in pitch-black freezing conditions. Sensory deprivation and physical exhaustion can absolutely trigger severe auditory and visual hallucinations, including phantom smells. But for the locals who actually know the grounds, the factual evidence from that night leans heavily into the supernatural. The wind might explain a creepy whisper, but it cannot physically grab the heavy wool of a winter coat and yank backward. Furthermore, extreme exhaustion might make a person smell medicine or see a ghost that isn't there, but an entire life-size brick structure cannot vanish into thin air, only to instantly reappear just in time to break a grown man's fall on the black ice. Marley survived the rest of his night shivering behind that oak tree, and he quit the very next morning. But to this day, the brick dollhouse still stands right there in Lynette, Alabama, just waiting for whoever takes the night shift next.